Hi, and welcome to Military 101. My name is Brother Logan Isaac, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about the Roman legions. In order to understand the legions, we have to understand Roman society as a whole and its caste system that it employed, made up of three basic classes. At the very top, we had patricians, and this is the aristocratic class. At the very top were the senatorius, or the senatorial families. Then in the middle we have the equestrian class, which is what you might think of as the early knighthood of the medieval period. And then finally the nobles, or the nobiles. And these were the commoners, or the citizens who were rising through the ranks up into the patrician class, either through the accumulation of wealth or status or something else that will earn them that place. In the middle, we have the plebeians, and this is what we call just regular commoners. These are citizens with legal status as Romans, and there were a bunch of different classes within the plebeians. Then finally, at the bottom, we have the proletariat, or the proletari. These are non-citizens, slaves, workers, and others at the bottom rung of the Roman social ladder. And so I'm borrowing the same colors to indicate and remind us where these class distinctions broke down and how they fed into the military. In Latin, militia is based off of milis, which is 1,000. And so the military is about ordering Roman society, structuring it, and giving it, giving it shape. So at the very bottom, we had the vigilius, or the vigilium, depending on if you're speaking Latin or English. And the vigilium were known as the watchmen, the vigilists, those who kept vigil. They were issued buckets to put out fires, and they patrolled the streets at night. They weren't given weapons because, again, they are part of the lowest caste. These are made up of slaves and workers. That's why I've used the red. And we could think of them as firefighters. They didn't have a military function, but they could be joined with some of the others, either the urbani or the praetors, to do military activity within Rome, but they weren't given their own weapons or any other means of, rising up. Above the vigilius, we have the cohorts urbani, or you could think of them as law enforcement police officers. These were Italian citizens from the plebeian class who were given weapons and who intervened in major crimes and patrolled the streets and generally watched over the city of Rome. Then at the very top, from the equestrian class, we had the praetors, or the Praetorian Guard. This was essentially the Secret Service, or the personal security detachment for Caesar. And they came from, as I said, the equestrian class. And because they spent so much time with the emperor, they often made up the inner circle of the different emperors that they served. And they could be a very politically loaded unit. If you could sway the praetors for or against a Caesar, you could change, the very nature of the empire as a whole. And then finally, throughout all of these, I've used yellow because it could be anybody from Rome. We have the cohorts legionum, or the legionary cohorts, which we'll talk about in depth. So this is a legion. A legion was nominally made up of 5,420 soldiers. That got plussed up to about 6,000 with administrators and other roles. At the very top, we had 7 officers, or military tribunes. The legate was the commander of the legion, and he was appointed by Caesar. Just below him was a broad-striped tribune who served as the second in command. And this is kind of a mid-level patrician who was on his way up. And then beneath him, we had narrow-striped tribunes. 5 narrow-striped tribunes, 1 broad tribune, and 1 legate. The different narrow-striped tribunes nominally were in charge of 2 cohorts. Every legion had 10 cohorts. 5 narrow-striped tribunes means 2 cohorts each. It didn't actually end up working that way, but nominally they were supposed to be in command of 2 cohorts, even though they mostly served administrative function. So the bulk of the legion was made up of plebeian citizen soldiers. They had 300 cavalry usually attached to a legion from the equestrian class. And in the 10 different cohorts, most of the cohorts were made up of centuries of 80 soldiers plus administrators and other support personnel. Those 80 soldiers were commanded by a centurion. And when I say centurion, don't think of a title, think of a rank. Think like little s sergeant. A centurion is in charge of all the 80 soldiers in his century, as well as the administrators, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, in each cohort, there are 6 centuries, 6 centurions. At the very top, the first cohort is a double strength cohort of 5 centuries made up of 160 soldiers each. And the first cohort was the best of the best, cream of the crop, etc., etc. The first cohort, this is where we get into like the titles of the centurions. At the very top, we had the Pilus Prior. The Pilus Prior you could think of as the command sergeant major of the entire legion. He worked beside the legate and his staff, and he was the best of the best, respected by everybody. He was also responsible for the other centurions in his cohort. Just like any other cohort, the top centurion was kind of, the father of all the other centurions, kind of. So the Pilus Prior, or first spear, not only was responsible for 4 primi ordines, which was the title for the centurions of the first cohort, but the Pilus Prior also was nominally responsible for all the princeps prior, which is the centurions outranking all the other centurions in a cohort. And so there were the 4 primi ordines that he was in charge of, as well as the 9 princeps prior for all the different cohorts. The princeps prior, obviously, was the highest ranking centurion of a cohort of 6 centuries. So you can think of the top as a command sergeant major, and then the princeps prior in charge of a cohort, you can think of them as like a master sergeant. Moving down from there, we have individual centuries made up of 80 soldiers broken out into 10 tents, or contubernia, made up of 8 soldiers. So 8 soldiers in one tent, 10 tents in a century, makes 80 men plus administrators and support personnel. Each centurion you could think of as a first sergeant, because a century is almost the same as an infantry company today in the United States Army, about 100 people. So you could think of them as a first sergeant. And each tent, or contubernia, contained 8 people, 8 soldiers, 8 grunts. So finally, here it is one last time. You can do the math if you like. About 6,000 men in a legion, broken down into their constituent parts in the different cohorts, and then into the centuries. If you have any questions, you want to learn more, check out pewpewhq.com, book a workshop where I can talk about this in much more depth, or subscribe to my Substack where I post about this kind of stuff fairly frequently, about once a week. And I'd love to see you there and answer any questions that you might have.